Hello, everyone. We're so glad to have Weekly Actions back on and starting this week with the theme of Let's Talk About Shutdown Canada. Our mission at Fridays for Future Toronto is to create a space for youth to advocate for a better world, for a future that recognizes and implements Indigenous rights, uplifts marginalized voices and communities, and follows principles of climate justice. You can find us on Instagram at Fridays for Future TO, Facebook, and you can email us fridaysforfutureto@gmail.com. And please ask any questions in the comments so we can make more content about this. So my name is Gabby Elhab. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a youth activist with Fridays for Future Toronto, and I'm so excited today to be joined by Sebastian to talk about Shutdown Canada. Sebastian is a 22-year-old university student and a community organizer based in Toronto, Canada with Venezuelan roots. They use any pronouns, and their activism work centers around housing justice, Indigenous sovereignty, racial justice, and the intersection of those issues with a particular focus in urban settings. Sebastian, it's so nice to be speaking to you today.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. This is going to be so fun. I love that your work is really intersectional because I think that's honestly what Shutdown Canada is all about. So before we start, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement, which is also something that we're going to be talking about today. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which we're holding our online actions. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, I'm personally speaking to you from so-called Toronto, and this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also acknowledge the privilege of online space that we have and the importance of using it to uplift voices and recognize the struggles that continue today on Turtle Island. So in all of our videos like these, we like to ask people, and I think especially with this topic, it's really important, these kind of follow-up questions. So Sebastian, how do you place yourself or reflect on what the land acknowledgement means to you?
Yeah, I think land acknowledgements are really important as somebody who is of like a migrant descent because like I'm from South America, I'm from Venezuela specifically, and my blood fusion, at least on my father's side, my mom is white, but on my father's side, his mix comes from intergenerational trauma of like displaced indigenous communities, and then also and slightly more significantly, um, African communities that were taken away from their homelands in West Africa and Yoruba land and brought to a foreign continent and forced into slave labor, right? And these dynamics, even though slavery was abolished in the early 1800s in Venezuela, existed informally until even my grandmother's time, where she was basically sold off in an auction at 15 years old to a husband, right? And that is the reality for Black or indigenous Venezuelans from rural communities whose parents were forced into such dire financial straits that they might have had to take issues with that, right? And because of these intersections of like the colonial society and the structures of Venezuela that are so harmful, my dad and my grandmother had to leave their lands, right, against their will. They never wanted to leave their lands, and they don't necessarily love love so-called Canada, and I don't either, right? I always wanted to have that connection, right? But I don't know much of, like I don't have much family left. I don't have much roots in Venezuela left because I've been here so long and I've lost that, right? So if somebody, I've seen family pictures, so I know that I do have like indigenous family members and Black family members, but when people ask, let's say, oh, do you know like which group they're from? Like, are they Guajiro or like Wayu, or are they like, Andean, or are they Amazonian, or like whatever? I'm like, well, actually, at that I don't know, and that I can't tell you, right? And that's because the structure of like Latin American states still promotes that level of erasure, right? And then leaving the diaspora into another country that promotes assimilation forces me to or forced me to disconnect with that level of culture until I was like quite a bit older, right? So I'm trying to like rebuild that personal sense of self and that personal sense of reflection and my place in relation to Venezuela and in relation to my ancestors and my ancestry. But that's much harder than if we keep acknowledging whose land we're on, and if indigenous communities have the opportunity to keep that tradition alive and like never let it go, right? So they're also trying to build that back. And I think like as folks who have settled on this land, we really need to support that effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think it's really amazing that we have these videos to hear how everyone feels connected to their own land, how feeling indigenous to a land is kind of a worldwide thing. It's really incredible. And going off of that, and also because of the topic of this thing, what intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this acknowledgement? Because I know in many institutions, they just do this acknowledgement, don't even know the words that they're saying in it, and just kind of leave it be.
Yeah, I think that boils down to how you take actions in your daily life, right? And like I'm a somewhat seasoned activist. I'm involved in like a lot of community work across a variety of activist groups. So like I'm always doing that work, but I understand that other people might not be or might not even know where to start. So it's always reflecting. Like reflecting, I think, is the most important, because if you have to, when you have words spoken to, you have to like absorb them, and you have to breathe them in and think about like what they are and what they mean, right? To understand like not only the words being said to you, but the world views that they come from. And so that, I think, is like the baseline of what you can do is, to sit and stop and think about like, okay, like what is this land acknowledgement talking about, and what's my positionality towards it, right? And then from there, if it is something that you do become passionate about, or it's something that you want to learn more about, then developing a level of praxis, or in simpleton terms, like planning and ideas around how to turn that into a tangible actions, and to how to decolonize whatever space you're in, right? Whether that be like a university institution, or like your block and like the people on your block, or like wherever you are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going off of those 2 points, I definitely know that all of my family, except me, I was the only person born in Canada in my family, so-called Canada. So it's really hard sometimes having a connection to this land, since all the culture I know is not from here, it's from the Middle East. So I know that although maybe I didn't create and this also goes to anybody at home watching, although I maybe have not created the oppressive systems that are put in place, they're still continuing while I'm here. And so we still have that responsibility to dismantle them beyond a land acknowledgement. And even when thinking about a land acknowledgement, I think we all need to research it a bit. I think we all need to really reflect on it and think about it. So I totally agree with that. Um, so continuing with that, since that is really going to be a large theme in all of this, we really wanted to make this video to lay out some general ideologies and thoughts and intentions and demands as well behind Shutdown Canada, which is why we have such an amazing organizer with us here. And also to help you at home engage in these actions, since I know a lot of people are interested and have been seeing this on many different accounts. So starting off, Sebastian, what does Shutdown Canada, the term, the movement, what we've been doing, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for myself, I've had to contend with a quote unquote like Canadian identity, and think about always what that looks like and my relation to it, right? So like when I came to Canada, I was at a very young age. So I like, whereas my people in my family maybe got to spend their teenage years back home and come here as like adults or like whatever, I didn't have that opportunity. But nonetheless, I was treated in a way that still made me feel like an outsider. So I don't necessarily have some sort of like deep connection um, to Venezuela. Like, well, I do, but like, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of like you're away from there, but then, and that's not your home anymore. That's not your house, even if it's your home. But where you are currently is also not a welcoming space, right? So I've thought always a lot about Canadian identity and like the flimsiness of it because it's so um, related to inclusion and exclusion. So then once I started doing activism and talking with Indigenous folks and having those opportunities to have those more fruitful discussions with these communities and individuals who put a lot of time and thought into what does being Canadian mean, like when you are literally Indigenous, then they have also come to conclusions of like this identity is flimsy, or even in their case, like the final conclusion, which was like the point that I think clicked for me, was it's fake. It's not real, right? Because what Canada is built on, it's built on unceded territory, lands that have never been surrendered, and then, they're exploited only for the purpose of profit. But that's not a cohesive country. That's not a cohesive society in any of the definitions that we would use to describe either of those things, right? So, I think I was like 2/3 of the way there because I was very much struggling with like Canadian identity and the fact that I was so shunned from it by like my peers, and like they didn't want me to be a part of it. And then I spent a lot of time thinking about like how flimsy it is, or what it's based off of. And then I kind of, with the help of like Indigenous knowledge, also come to the conclusion that like, well, it's actually not real, and it's not based in anything other than the exploitation of Indigenous lands, right? And to another extent, like of Indigenous people. So once you're in that context, things become much clearer. So I feel like for me, it's important because it was a deep exercise of clarity, and then an opportunity to do something about it, because the Shutdown Canada movement also has a list of call to actions to participate in, beyond just like a slogan.
Yeah, of course. And I definitely understand what you mean when you say Canadian identity is kind of fake. I mean, we started this movement, I mean, to begin with, because we saw all these Indigenous injustices happening over Canada. We saw the Mi'kmaq lobster trap, whole fiasco that was and is kind of still continuing. We see these water crises and how just Trudeau says that we are not going to meet the goal to end all long-term bottled water advisories. It's sorry, boil water advisories. It's absolutely horrible. And so, we start that movement that way, but then when we come out to these actions, we see all these allies. We kind of hear all these stories, and it definitely makes us think about this Canadian identity and what land we really are protesting on right now and all that kind of stuff. So thank you, and I absolutely agree. For a second question, and once again, these really do all go into each other. Most of our actions, if you at home or you, Sebastian, have been there, they've been in person, they've been blocking roads for long periods of times and chanting and singing wonderful songs. It's really beautiful. Although we always have marshals and volunteers helping direct traffic and any hostile people there, a lot of people ask what's so effective about blocking a road if you're just blocking random people trying to like get home from work. So what would you say to those people?
I think it's similar to how I came to these conclusions. It's an exercise in political and educational awareness, right? So people, like when a country is fake, like if Canada as a concept is fake, at least semi-functionally, um, it is still real because there's still like a road that people drive on, or like a city that people live in, a house people live in, right? So if you just say shut down Canada and there's no strategy attached to like having education beyond that, or if you say like Canada's fake and then there's no like education beyond that, people are like, okay, well, my house is fake. I drove to work today. Like my job's not fake. This road's not fake. This car's not fake. Um, so then you have to kind of almost disrupt like that commute, right? And be like, no, fuck, like this road isn't real because like we can just sit on it, right? And like do what we want, like shut it down. And I think that can be, obviously there's a lot of people who are going to get pissed off and be like, nah, fuck, you're like, messing up my commute. But then there's a lot of people that pause and reflect, right? And like I've seen folks, um, you know, they get blocked in traffic, and then they honk the horn, but actually in support of us, and they're like, "Whoa, like, keep doing what you're doing." So like for every negative reaction, there's also a positive reaction, and those are folks who may not show up to protests or just living their everyday lives, but because of these consistent moments and these consistent disruptions, even when they're in the middle of it, it's like almost like a come to Jesus moment for them, because then they're like, oh, look, like it's happening in front of me. And then am I going to make the choice to support it or to stand in opposition of it? Right.
Mhm.
And I think if you just limit it to like Facebook posts or like whatever you choose to do that's not in person activism, and like the shutting down of like these fake roads on these real lands, it doesn't, yeah, it just kind of like buries our ability to reach new people, and to keep up momentum, right? And then to put what we're preaching into actionable, tangible actions that have power.
Yeah, thank you. And I completely agree. I mean, what can I say? You're saying great things. You're an organizer, but yes, you're totally right. I mean, I also see a lot of people like that who are just mad because they think that we're blocking a road for the sake of blocking a road, but everybody knows that's just completely counterproductive. And yes, I don't know how else to say I agree, but you are killing it, Sebastian. Thank you. Thank you very much. And like following on to that as well, a lot of these people have complaints about COVID and how we are running actions through COVID. I'd like to start off by saying as well, all of our actions are socially distanced. Everybody is wearing a mask. If you don't have a mask, we provide you with a mask. If you don't have hand sanitizer, we provide you with hand sanitizer. We have chairs for disabled people if they need to sit down. These really, really are inclusive actions. And in terms of the intentions, I think this is really important, especially right now that we're seeing places like Neskantaga where this pandemic is making their water situation worse. And it's not like we're protesting something unsolvable. This is a choice at this point that to make this worse, we're in a pandemic and you're still not giving them clean water. So it's really not just like a protest for the sake of protest. And it's really not just protesting during COVID for like a statement of that sort. It's really like we have the choice, we do, to provide these people with things that would help them go through a pandemic and still make it out safe, but we're not. And so to follow up with that whole statement, I guess, what would you kind of tell people maybe before going to an action, either like safety wise, whether that's COVID wise, or whether that's through, our marshals, kind of like safety wise, just kind of what to know, I guess, what to expect almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be grounded in human rights, and I think that what the pandemic is doing is accelerating what has been happening, especially like in the neoliberal era of this kind of rush to not have state intervention in anything except for the police, right? And then having the police not only being like an arm of enforcement for the state, but actually like a key policy maker in the state apparatus, and a key decision maker with so much autonomy as to what to like destroy or keep alive, right? So I think with COVID or not, it is important to still keep things going in terms like protests and social movements as normal, because COVID will hopefully end eventually. But what's going to matter is what we come out to on the other side of it. And it's the same with like the climate crisis, right? Like we see these like floods and typhoons and stuff like that aren't natural, that are now happening in places where they never happened traditionally. And what is the outcome of that, right? Like I think we're seeing in places like Guatemala, which is one of the, well, it is, yeah, it's a country with like an indigenous majority, right? And it's like well over 50% of the population is indigenous. And they're also like really affected by the climate crisis. So, two concurrent category, the highest category of hurricanes in less than a week at the same time, where the like emergency preparedness budget is slashed by like 90%, and food free food distribution to malnourished families is slashed by like 90%. Most of whom benefit from these projects are indigenous, right? And then that's transferred to like these like corporate giveaways. So I think, and they're protesting pretty hard in Peru. Indigenous communities are protesting pretty hard in Ecuador and Colombia and other places. And we have to learn from that of like, these are also countries that were hard hit by the virus, but they understand the need for maintenance of social movement and the ability to check state power, because the nation state really is the ultimate virus, right? Like the nation state, to an extent, caused the spread of this virus so significantly through, like, for example, not consulting with communities and having like bloated federal programs that like kind of like overrode the decisions and the knowledge of like indigenous communities or migrant communities that knew themselves well, preventing international cooperation from happening between subnational entities, thus causing, like, if we know, for example, in Ontario, we have like a larger portion of people flying from countries that are hard hit from the virus because Toronto is like a center of commerce. We have like a higher proportion of people flying in than, let's say, Nova Scotia. Why wouldn't Ontario and places like Italy or China or wherever start having conversations with their communities in between their respective communities, right? So in that case, it's like never back down from the state, because the state is not an omnipotent entity, and it's certainly not a correct entity. It doesn't make the right decisions, right? So we need to still always be holding the state accountable.
And even during COVID as well. I mean, usually, like without COVID, it's kind of like growing and fixing these systems, which are already so difficult to do, and then trying to think about what we can do past that. But now there's already a third layer, which is why I think it's also incredibly important to protest during COVID, whether it's online, which I'll also get to, but also in person with Shut Down Canada, which does have online components. But yeah, it's extremely important because we're at a point now where we're repairing these things, which anybody on the land that we're protesting on, any person who's really getting upset by this traffic or upset by the fact that we're holding a protest completely safely and socially distanced, is getting upset about, they're not having the same problems of the people who are protesting. These are really things that we're trying to repair. Like all of this is like truly like protesting for the bare minimum. And especially at COVID, I think it's so clear to see that. And that leads me to our next question as well, which is how can people support Shutdown Canada? How can people also advocate within it? But also just going off of that, whether they can participate in an online action that we may post during the strike itself, but if they can't participate in those, if they can, if they just want to participate and kind of learn a lot about this, what can they do? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think what's important is that like we have our thing, and that for the most part is like this smaller group of people that we kind of get together to do these like surprise shutdowns, right? And that's something like that our networks are collectively deciding to work on, right? But that's like our friend group. Like, you know, I'm like personal friends as well as like co-organizers with a lot of the folks in our like small little pod in Toronto. So it doesn't have to be like we can't carry this whole movement ourselves as the like 5 or 6 consistent individuals that we are. It really so when people are like, how can I come to this action or whatever, I'm like, well, I'm probably not going to tell you much about this action, but I would really support you if you got 10 of your friends in your neighborhood and you shut down the street too, because we have 100 people. That's just like because of our, let's say, experience in activism and the type of people that we can bring out and the trust that we build. But you don't need that many people to shut down the street. Like you can get it with like 10, but at least you can hold it off for like 20 minutes or something, you know? And it's like, do that, like build, you know, build and triangulate like practice within your own communities, because you probably sit in spaces where you as an individual are taking a backseat or ceding space to colonial and white supremacist mentalities, to colonial and white supremacist actions. So if you confront that, that's radical in its own way, even if it's just like having an argument with like a shitty old white dude off. It's not like I'm not saying that's like you can just be a contrarian and like call it a day. I mean, there's like other things you have to do, but if that's what you have the capacity to do, and if you have the capacity and the confidence to disrupt your own spaces, look towards that, and not kind of like looking towards other people to carry the water for you, and you just show up, right? Because all of this stuff that we're working on is ultimately a collective effort for a society that like collectively assesses situations to actually meet individual needs as well as collective community needs.
Yeah, definitely. And then within bringing that to communities, I think it's really important kind of like what you learn from an action as well. So if you're coming down from this, big action, back to your white neighborhood where nobody knows the difference between different terms and stuff. Anyway, when you come back to that, it really shows how much you learned. And if you're not going to practice what you learn from a large action, it's like how much will your community really like benefit and stuff like that. So I totally agree with that. And also for people at home who maybe really cannot attend an in-person action right now, maybe you have people at home who would be hurt if COVID was in that space, then that makes a lot of sense. And whenever we have a large in-person action, even though Sebastian, I loved what you said about shutting down a street in your own community, I totally recommend that. So if you want to do that, please do that. But if you can't do that either, we usually post when an action is happening, in the amount of time that it would take for you to like show up there and come participate as well. If you can't do that, we usually have an online component, whether that's a phone zap or an email zap or a conversation just like this to really sit down and kind of think about this. And then after watching this, you'd go and do an action of yourself. So yeah, and bringing that in now to our next question as well. Sebastian, I love that you're so engaged in your community. I think that's like extremely important right now, especially with this movement, with COVID, with weather getting colder, and with the government really, really not putting a focus on many different groups that are hurting right now. I think we'd like to know, and I'd like to know, what can we do, for you, for your community? I'll have any donations or profiles or anything in the bio, so please like go wild. Give us like an action we can do, whether that's donating to something, sharing something. Please, like the floor is yours.
Yeah, fair. I mean, I came off just some fundraising campaigns, so I'm not doing too much personally right now. I know that there are a few campaigns that are really interesting. Khalil's campaign to do building tiny homes and encampments and stuff like that, and heated spaces. Really important. They have a GoFundMe up, as does Nanook and Bree from Toronto Indigenous Harm Reduction, who have a great campaign going. And I think they're on the verge of meeting their goals, but they've also taken some of that money and put it towards Nunavut, which is becoming extremely hard hit by COVID right now. So I think that they're actually going to need more money as well to continue doing work both here in Toronto, supporting homeless folks in encampments during COVID and just more broadly, but then also to support the territory that Nunavut is from. Which is being just like murdered by COVID. So I think that is like, both of those folks have GoFundMes up, and I really encourage donating to that. I also definitely encourage sending donations, which I think is just done through e-transfer. It's like the Encampment Support Network, but just like DM them and reach out to them, and they'll definitely have information on how to support and how to donate. It's a bit of like a loose coalition of activists anyways. So we also have actually something happening in Little Jamaica right now with supporting Black businesses financially that have been affected not only by the pandemic, but 10 years of extreme government mismanagement through this Metrolinx construction project, which though is bringing transportation to certain neighborhoods, is also being used as an entry point to gentrify and displace Black residents who live along the west portion of Eglinton Avenue. So we are doing work supporting businesses now, and we're scaling on doing work supporting tenants so that the neighborhood can still exist when this project is over, which honestly is looking like maybe like at least 2 or 3 years before even completion, and it's been 11 already. So really, really critical work being up there. There's a GoFundMe for that as well that I'll shoot down and I'll shoot over to you. And yeah, I think just in general though, it's always going to be important for folks to get in their own communities and then look at what organizing looks like in their own communities, in their own spaces, what their entry points are. And I mean, I don't think you should ever be afraid to reach out to activists that you see on social media, or activist organizations like Fridays for Future, or Climate Justice Toronto, or other groups that do have entry points on how to get started in organizing. So it never hurts to hit them up, but really look at the situation around you and reflect on the circumstances around you, which I think is always a very good entry point in how to get into organizing, right? It's like, I did start in like racial justice movements when I was like living at my parents' house at 16 years old in Ottawa, and like working with like the local Black Lives Matter like affiliated chapters there, and kind of like doing organizing alongside them. So I did that work. And then I like when I came to Toronto and I became a tenant, realized about like rent issues and housing law. And like, I was homeless for 6 months, and just like kind of positioning myself in there and then landing in the neighborhood, which is great. And I'm happy to have secure housing. But like also being in a beleaguered building with like a whole litany of issues constantly, which actually affects me the least because I do have like some level of white privilege and some like knowledge of and command of English that allows me to get the things I want from building management. But we're a neighborhood of like migrant workers, mostly in St. Jamestown, right? So just watching like what happens there kind of spurred me into action of like, oh no, like I need to organize like people in my building. And then that kind of like connected me with like Keep Your Rent folks, and like they were looking at what I was doing, and other groups right around the city. So whatever that looks like in your neighborhood, I mean, if you're a homeowner, you probably, or if you live in like your parents' home, your core focus of knowledge might not be tenants' rights. But you might be like, I don't know, like a computer science student, and like you're really interested in like cybersecurity and like how the government uses technology to like surveil racialized communities or something like that, right? It's like, okay, we'll talk about that. Like do a bunch of digital activism about that. There's like great, and there's like Fight for Future, which is like a great organization that does a lot of stuff around cybersecurity. Like there's always a niche somewhere, and there's a community of people who are going to be passionate about it, and who are going to place it within broader systemic issues, because it all kind of leads back to the same road, which is like capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy. So look at what your passion points are and your issues of focus, and then build around that. And you will, even if you're the only person preaching this one thing, you won't be the only person for long. But we live in a society of people who are made to feel scared for coming out and saying something that departs from being radical, that departs from being status quo and instead dives into being radical. But people have these thoughts. It's just so, you might be punished by liberal media or some sort of like, a government might have disdain for you or whatever, but you're not alone. And I think that's really important. You're not alone in facing your issues. So you got to build kind of like trans community or cross community solidarity, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll be putting all of those links in the bio. So y'all at home watching, after you learn about this and you educate yourself on this, please go to the bio. And your action for today is definitely to look at all of those links. Please donate to any if you can. And if you can't, share it with at least 3 friends, because then they're going to share it. And then at least one person is going to donate. And that's extremely important. And I I really, really love what you said about kind of your own personal contributions. I even know that for me and for many of my like activist friends as well, we'd look and we'd totally like wholeheartedly support these movements that we did care about, that we were educating ourselves on, but we didn't really think at the end of the day that our voice really mattered. I think I've been thinking about that a lot recently, about how I can really bring in what I know, what I care about. And obviously I care about these large movements, clearly. But I think you do have to kind of have that awareness of where you are, where you place yourself, and kind of where you want to go, so that you really can contribute all that you can to these sorts of things. And this is such a good conversation. Wow. Okay. But we do have to finish up. So thank you so, so much, Sebastian, for talking with me about Shutdown Canada, but also about so many important issues that we should all go home and like research and learn about, please. And even if you don't have maybe the means to even do that research or donate somewhere, just looking within yourself, looking at what you care about, looking around at the people in like in your community, kind of seeing like what they need, what they want to talk about, what they need support in as well, is really, really valuable. So thank you so much for joining us. Once again, if you want to keep up with any Shutdown Canada updates, check out Fridays for Future Toronto on Instagram. Also Climate Justice Toronto posts a lot of good stuff. Definitely follow Sebastian. We'll have their in the bio. They're always posting wonderful things. And yeah, just amazing, incredible organizers that you should be keeping up with. And please ask any questions in the comments below, whether it's for Sebastian about this movement in general or about anything mentioned in here. We really want to make content in this new kind of chapter of Weekly Actions that really answers your questions, that really helps you get going with any contribution that you'd like to make. So with all of that said, oh, and also if you ever want to contact us, go to fridaysforfutureto@gmail.com. I love doing that little for. So thank you so much, Sebastian, for joining us. That's such a good time. My brain feels like expanded. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your contributions.
Yes, glad to have added some folds to that brain. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I'm always glad to talk more about it. Of course, I'll shoot you over my Instagram, and then I guess it'll be linked below. Anyone who does kind of want to have more conversations and deeper conversations, I mean, I'm literally always on my phone, so always happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Yeah, and definitely now in COVID, please take advantage of like your online community and please reach out like that because they could use a lot of help like that as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Sebastian. Everybody, please stay safe. Remember to shut down Canada wherever you are, whether you're not even in Canada. Please keep researching. Please keep learning. Shut down your problems if you see them too. So yeah.
Yeah, shut down your country. Like every country has so many fucking problems that it all needs to be shut down, right? Like shut down the nation state, right? Like we want to obviously export this to broader social movements, and we're also learning from bigger social movements, right? Like I've learned so much from my folks back home, and I mean I think reconnecting with my culture and my world is probably the most important thing that I've ever done in my activism.
And we're so grateful to have learned about that. Just a little look into that today. So everybody, please keep following Sebastian. Please keep following this movement. It's amazing. We're going to keep coming up with stuff about this and any questions you all have. So stay safe, take care, and shut it down. Shut it down. Bye, everyone.
Actually, bye.